In this video, I'm going to talk about how to do some logging with MariaDB. So we're going to go through some tutorials here. So the first thing I want to do, let me just clear these screens so we can start from scratch. I'm just in the root directory on both of these. I'm going to use the top one to do our logging, and I'm going to use the bottom screen just to run some SQL queries and restart the services and things like that, so we can see what we're trying to do. Since we're mostly concerned about logging here, I think I'm going to change to the directory where the logs are for MariaDB. So by default, the logs for MariaDB by default are, if they're not defined in any other way, they're always going to be in the data directory. But I find that when you install MariaDB for Linux, typically by default the config file is going to put the logs in the var log directory. And if you go into var log, you're going to see a whole bunch of directories, but notice there's one for MySQL. So like a lot of the other things that we work with, we'll find the log files there. So I'm going to switch directory to MySQL. And if we look in that directory, we can already see there's an error log, right? And I can look at the contents of it. You could use VI to look at the contents. I know a lot of you probably have been using VI to edit these text files, but cat just outputs the contents of the file. By the way, another command that you can use is tail. So if you pass into tail the path to the file, this one is just error.log because I'm already in the var directory, and it'll output the last, I think the last 10 lines by default. But more importantly, what you can do if you're actively debugging a server, if you use the -f command, it will continuously output the log. So if I come down here and I, let's say we wanted to restart the server, right? Since we know that a restart is first going to shut the database down, then it's going to bring the database back up, we should see some information in this log telling us about, that it's shutting down and starting back up. And instead of looking at the log file periodically to see what's going on, I can just output it in real time. So you can see I hit the command at the bottom to restart. It's currently restarting. You can see the log entries in real time on the console. You could also, when you start MariaDB, there's an option to start MariaDB where it outputs everything to the console. And you certainly could do that. I find it kind of annoying to output everything right to the console, but that would work as well. So as you read in the reading for this unit, the error log really is only going to output things about starting up and stopping the database. And if we do something that causes an error, we'll see that. So, oops, I meant to do Control-C up here. So I'm going to hit Control-C to get out of the tail command. Let's try to create an error, right? So we're going to try to do something that's going to throw an error into this log, so we can see what that looks like, and we get a sense of how to work with these error messages, or how to work with the error log. So to do that, let's do something in the config file. So we're going to go into etc MySQL. Let's see, the config file is going to be under MariaDB. .config.d, and most of the stuff that we're worried about is going to be in 50-server.cnf. So if I go in here, I should be able to just put something fake in here, and it'll probably generate some kind of an error message, right? So let's just go through here. Here we go, base directory. I'm going to put something on the end of this. I'm going to hit A to append, and I'm going to put an A on the end of that. And it's probably going to throw an error, right, as it starts, if I had to guess. Let's see if that works. So I'm going to save that. And then I am going to run that tail command again. Try to restart the service, see what it does. Well, it started. So let's see if we can do something else that causes an error. I'm going to set that back just so I don't forget that I put that on the end there. Just going to hit the, well, normally you would just hit X, but there we go. All right, let's see. What else can we do in here that's going to cause an error? Let's try. I'm pretty sure the database isn't going to start up if we put an invalid temp directory. If it can't create the temp directory, it shouldn't be able to start, because it's where it puts its cache file, which we learned a little bit about earlier in this semester or the quarter. So I'm going to add an A on the end of temp, right? And there's a couple different things you could do in here to break it, right? You could try different things, but so let me write this and quit. All right, so I'm going to, let's tail this file. Oh, let's do a restart down here. There we go. All right, so here we get an error message, right? And I'll do it again so we can see it, right? It's going to try to start it. And we get an error. It can't start because, and it says right here, it can't create the temp file, right? And if I were troubleshooting, that would tell me to go and look at the path for the temporary file and see if it's valid, make sure I got permissions and all that other stuff. Now, there's a lot of other stuff in here, right? So if we wanted to, we could, let's do this. I'm going to Control C from here, and we'll cat the contents of the error log. Right? There's a lot of stuff in there. So we could instead use the grep command. Right? So with the grep command, you can show just certain things. You can look for certain keywords in each line, and it'll output that line. In this case, there are 3 possible types of messages in the error log, right? There's an error, a note, or a warning. So I can show just those if I wanted to, right? So I could say, I don't care about all the junk in here. All I care about is the error messages because I'm trying to troubleshoot, right? I don't know if a lot of times we want to see not just the error messages but other things, but if you're looking for something specific in an error log, it's a good idea to get used to how to use grep. Unfortunately with grep, so here's the thing is if I put, let's say I know I want to look for error, right? So I'm going to put those brackets around it, right? Because I'm looking for the word error in brackets because I know that that's the thread type that I'm looking for. And then I put the file name. So in this case, it's going to be error.log. It outputs everything, right? Not just errors. So because it's a regular expression that contains the brackets, it ignores the brackets. So you have to use a single quote and a backspace. The backspace is the escape, which it makes it a literal string, basically. So now I should just see the errors, right? So I ran that command, and now I only get the errors. And what's neat about this is I could, let's go to the front here, and we'll tail again, error.log. We're going to pipe that into the grep command and look only for errors. So now, as it's sitting here waiting for lines, we're only going to see errors pop up. So there's other things that are happening, but only the error pops up in this log. So that's basically how you do this. And if I wanted to output this to another file, right? So for the assignment, I'm going to Control C. For the assignment, you're going to have to output a file so that you can turn it in for the assignment. So you're going to do something like this. So we're going to put error.log, and we're going to create a new file called, I'm going to call mine Brian, well, deliverable A. Whoops, I forgot. Can't put the slash on the front. Sorry about that. So now I've got that deliverable A.txt, and it's only going to have what I'm looking for, right? So it only has the errors in it. It doesn't have anything else, which is exactly what I want. Now for you, for this assignment, make sure there's something unique. Don't call it temp A. Maybe either use some other parameter that you think is going to break it. Maybe experiment a little bit with some other parameters and see what breaks it and what doesn't break it. Or if you are going to use temp, maybe put your name on the end or something, right? So mine would be TMP Brian or something like that. Or TMP BCG 28, which is my Drexel ID. I could do something like that. All right, so that's the first part. That's deliverable A. This is how you're going to output an error log. Now, how do you configure error logging in MariaDB? Let's take a look at the config file. So we're going to use VI. So it's going to be under etc. All right, so let's scroll down to error logging, and you should see something similar in your servers, right? So right here, we've got the path to the error log, right? So log error equals var log MySQL error.log. When you read the documentation, there are other parameters that you could put in here, right? So other parameters such as the verbosity of the log, right? So what kinds of information do we want in that log? You can add additional parameters here. So there's some interesting things you could do with the logging to give it, for a little bit more meaningful logging. But for this lab, I'm not going to ask you to do that. We're just going to jump right into looking at the other two types of logs that we discussed in class. So the other two types are the general query log and the slow query log, and I want to show you both logging to file and how we can use logging to a database table. So we can look at both. So let's start with the let's while we're in this file, let's start with the general log, right? So here we have, and it happens to already be in here, and it's just commented out. So I'm going to uncomment these two lines. This one tells us where to put the log file for the general log. So it's going to be in a log file called mysql.log. And then here we have the general log is set to 1, which means turn on general logging. This, I have to uncomment the one on the top as well. That's going to tell us how we want to do the log output. In this case, we're going to tell it to use a file for the log output. The other option is table, which we're going to look at that as well. I'll show you both options. But let's start with the file option. So with file running, I'm going to quit. Oh, I have to fix the server. So if you recall, I broke mine by adding temp A here, so I have to take that out. There we go. All right, so now I should be able to restart my database server. And if I look at, okay, so now I have a mysql.log, right? Let's take a look at mysql.log. So we have nothing in there yet, right? It's just saying that it started. That's it. All we know is that the server started, and some stuff is happening. So let's see what happens as we start to use the server, what we get in this general log file. So we're going to do mysql.log for our general log file. So tail-f, again, that's just going to output lines. Down here, we're going to connect to MySQL Server. I'm just going to use root, but it would probably be good for you guys to try to use your accounts to do this that you created in lab or in practical assignment 2A. All right, so I'm connected. Now notice what happened at the top. As soon as I connected, it shows that I'm connected. Now watch what happens when I, oops, sorry. So when I tell it I want to use college scorecard, notice what it does, right? In the background, as soon as you tell it use college scorecard, it goes and tries to get a field list, right, of all the different fields. And when I do a select statement, so select star from, school, I'm going to do a limit so that we don't kill our database. And look what happened. It shows me the query up at the top, right? And what I could do up here, just like I did before, I can pipe this into grep. Oops, sorry, it should be a lowercase. And let's say I'm only looking for queries. So I'm going to type query. And now, if let me exit this, it doesn't show me anything, right? Nothing is happening in that log file because I'm filtering it based on queries. So let me connect again. And I'm going to use college scorecard. Before we got some, some messages there, but not yet. Then I'm going to do select star from admissions. Just going to show one record. And you can see there that it worked, right? So we can log pretty much every single query. The only problem with this log is it's very verbose, right? There's going to be a lot of logging. If you have lots of applications all using, or lots of user accounts, or lots of activity in your database, you can get an idea that there's going to be a lot of stuff getting logged into this file, right? In that case, if you get a lot of stuff being logged into this file, that's going to be a problem over time, right? Because the log file is going to grow exponentially. So I want to show you real quick. Number one, how we can kind of mitigate that. So one thing we can do to mitigate that, let's go back into our config file. There is a global setting in the config file. If we scroll down, there we go. So expire log days equals 10 means it's only going to keep logs for 10 days. and the max bin log file size is 100 megabytes. So the first item that you see here is going to apply to the text log files, and the second option is going to apply to the bin logs. We haven't talked much about bin logs in this unit. We're going to talk more about those later on. We talk about replication and clustering. So we'll get into more detail about what that is and why we use that later on. But for right now, all we have to know is that we can set the expire log days. We can also use the log rotation mechanism that's built into Linux. There's a whole log rotation infrastructure that's already in Linux that you can also use to manage these log files. You can use third-party tools like Splunk is a good example of one that will manage these log files for you and help you drill information out of your log files instead of using things like, oh, whoops, I have to quit this. So you have various tools that you could use. But what I want to show you too is we can also, by the way, we want to output that log file to a so we're going to output this to a text file. So I'm just going to use cat MySQL log, and then deliverable b.txt. So now I've got a deliverable b, and there's the contents, right? That's what I want, something like that. So this is basically what you're going to do for the assignment. So the next part of the assignment, so here's one of the problems with these log files too is it generates a lot of extra, it uses more resources to write out these log files, right? It's extra work for the database engine to do all that. So it can impact performance. So we don't always want these log files running all the time. So that's one thing I want to mention real quick. But there's another option here. So there's one other problem that we have here. And this, when we do file-based logging, there's not a lot of information here. We know the date and time that the user submitted the query. We know that it was a query, and we know what the query was, but we don't know who the user is. There's some stuff in here that, there's some things in here that maybe we could use to help troubleshoot, but it's not going to help us, right, if we don't have that information. Now, the 2 and the 3 that you see here refers to the connection, so maybe that would help because we can trace everything that a certain connection is doing. In fact, you could use grep to do that, right? So with grep, if I know that it's connection number 5 or connection number 364 that I'm troubleshooting, I know that application has a certain connection because I'm monitoring this log and I can see the activity. I say, okay, I know that they're thread number 5, and I can try to grep for just thread number 5 and just see all of their queries using the tail command. So I can see everything for that that single connected instance instead of everybody, all the queries from everyone across the whole server. So you can do some interesting stuff with the grep command. But I could also get more information if I log to a database table as opposed to logging into the into a file. So let me show you how to configure that. This is going to be for deliverable 3. So I'm going to scroll up and I'm going to change the log output from file. And I'm going to change it to table. And assuming I did this right, I'm going to have to restart the service. So let me do a restart. All right, so now I'm going to connect to the database again. Use college scorecard. Whoops, select star from, I don't know, academics. Just switching it up a little bit here. All right, so we have one result. And what I want to show you now is where we can go find this. So since we're logging to a file now, we should be able to find a table. So I'm going to show create table just so we can see the schema for a special table in the MySQL schema called general log. I think that's what it's called. Let's see if that works. There we go. So this is what the create statement looks like for general log. It has an event time, the user host, the thread ID, server ID, command type, argument, right? So we've got lots of information here. So now I could probably figure out, I could probably look at information about a specific user. So for example, if I just do a select statement, select star from MySQL general log. All right, there's a lot of stuff here. Let me just make this bigger so you can see it. So lots of stuff in here, right? I have had this logging on before, so there's still records in there, right? But you can see this is actually the last query that I did right here, right? This is the query that I ran to show the create state. This is actually the query that I used to select from this table. And you can see here that it tells me the username, right? So we have the username, and then we have the host name from which they logged in. So we can get pretty granular with what we're looking for about a user. We can use any standard select statement to do this, right? So instead of just doing select star from this whole thing, I can do where user host. I think it's user host. Let me go back and look here. It's you know what? Let's just do the show create again. So it's user underscore host. So we can look for user underscore host. I'm just going to use like root. So now this only shows me root. Of course, I only have queries from root right now, right? It shows me all those queries that that root is using. So I've got a little bit more control over what I'm working with, or what I'm looking for. By the way, this another way you can output this. So let's look at that create statement again. I just want to show you what this looks like. Notice that the engine is not InnoDB and it's not ARIA or any of the other database engines that we talked about. So we talked about these different database engines that are available in MariaDB. I never really talked about CSV, right? But CSV is just a comma separator, comma delimitated file, right? So it's a really simple schema. And technically, you could open it up in Microsoft Excel, right? So you could go and take the data file for this table, right? And you could export it and open up in Excel if you wanted to. You could also, if you wanted to, you could actually alter this table to use the InnoDB engine if you wanted to. And then it would be like any other table in the database. It's not a CSV anymore. It's actually, a real table. So you could do that. And there's some commands you can run to alter it. We didn't really talk about alter table in this course. That's really, we talked about, I think, a little bit in Info 365, but that's certainly an option. You can certainly do that. But I want to show you too that when you run these commands on some of these logging tables, sometimes it's helpful to add a /g on the end. It's going to make it in a little bit more of a human readable format when you do that. It's going to take out, so it's not going to try to format it as columns and columns and fields, which is hard to read in the when you're looking at it in the screen, right? So if we go back to because of the client that we're using. So if we go back here and do a /g on the end, you can see it looks a little bit different, right? So it's a little bit easier to read this way. So if you want to use the /g, it's actually called the reverse solidus, right? It's the button above your enter key typically on most keyboards. But you can use that option to look a little bit cleaner. And again, you could output this to a text file if you like. And you can do that right from the MySQL command. So you can use the MySQL command to run this query and output to a text file. And you'll call that text file deliverable c.txt. So again, that's doing the same thing we did before, but we're using database table instead of using a file for our logging. So the next topic I want to cover is the last two sections of our deliverable. Let's go back and look in our config file. We also have options, and I'm going to change this from table back to. Oh, whoops! I don't know why it always puts me right in edit mode. So I'm going to change this back to file. And we're going to scroll down here a little bit. And here we have our slow query logs, right? So I'm going to uncomment the slow query logs. and we are going to add some options here. So my long query time, your default for long query time may be something a lot more than 1 second. I set mine to 1 second, so any query that takes longer than a second, it should get logged in the long query log. The log slow rate limit, if you set that to 1, it's going to log every single query. But if you set that to, say, 5, it's only going to log 1 in 5 queries. So every 5th query is going to get logged, which means you're only going to log about 20% of the queries. The verbosity is, again, I think I talked about verbosity with other log files, but that's how much information. So there's some different options for verbosity that you could set, and you can play with that. And there's also an option here to set the number of rows that must be in the query, and I think the default is 1,000. So we can explicitly set that. So that parameter, and I'm just going to add it to the bottom here. Let me see, am I in insert mode? All right, so it's going to be min underscore examined underscore row underscore limit. So basically the minimum examined row limit, according to the documentation, I'm just going to read it from the documentation for you. It says, it is beneficial to log queries that examine a minimum number of rows. The slow query log can be configured to log queries that examine a minimum number of rows regardless of their execution time by setting the min examined row limit. So what that means basically is that there has to be a minimum number of rows that are returned by the query in order for it to be caught by this by the trap for this logging. So for example, I could put 1,000 and so I have to get at least 1,000 rows back before it's going to log it. I'm going to set it to just 1 row, right? I want it to just give me as much as it can because we're kind of playing with this and we want to see how it works. So I'm going to tell it, give me any query that takes over a second that returns at least 1 row, and that's it. And it's going to put it in a file called MariaDB/slow log. And actually, just to make it easier for us, let me get rid of the MariaDB part here. We'll just call it slow.log. So I'm going to write that. In order for this to work, we have to restart MariaDB. And I wonder if it's going to... There we go. All right, so let me run a query. All right, that took 0.52 seconds. And if we look at our log files, we don't have a slow.log yet because I think we need it to take at least a second. I think one way you can do that, I'm not sure if you have the sleep command in MariaDB. Let's see if that works. So sleep for 2 seconds. Oh, it did work. Good. So it went to sleep for 2 seconds. So it took longer than 2 seconds to return a query. And I do not see a log file yet. So we forgot one parameter in here. So slow query logging, you can turn it on for certain accounts and connections to do that log, but we could just turn it on globally by setting the slow query log value to a 1. So you do have to add this parameter that you see in my config file. So right here on this line where it says slow query log equals 1, you'll need to add that one. So we added that one. We also set the minimum examined row limit to a 1. So hopefully we'll see some additional information. So once you add that field, oh, whoops, I did not mean to do that. Let me exit this. So once you add that, you'll have to restart. And we'll give that a second to restart. I'll lose the connection on the bottom, but that's okay. So now I've got my slow.log. So if we output the contents of slow.log, there's nothing in there yet, right? So it's completely empty. And assuming we did this right, if I select sleep 2, no, it has to reconnect, so give it a second. So if I select that, hopefully we have some stuff in here now. and we don't, not yet. We could possibly maybe do a real query, select star from school S, join admissions A on A.op ID equals. Hopefully you remember your join statements from the Info 365. We'll put a little limit on this. We'll select 100 rows, let it run. Took 1.15 seconds. There we go. So it output the, so it logged that query, right? So it met the the number of rows examined is 75,112, which is more than 1, right? So it actually output the information. So again, it might make sense, if you're using this this logging, it might make sense to use the grep command to only look for lines that contain certain information, right? So maybe I'm only looking for the for lines that are the actual query, right? So I could use the grep command to filter anything that's not an actual query. So in this case, these are all queries, right? These are actually statements that somebody's making, that somebody's putting into their, into a client. So we could do that. We could, in the pattern I could look for here is there's a pound space in front of each line that maybe I don't care about, right? But once again, the text file limits us just a little bit. So it would be helpful if we could do this with a, with a database table as opposed to a text file. So just like you did in the previous version, right? You use the, you output this file to a text file and then you turn that in. You're going to do the same thing here, right? So use that same command, but change the grep parameters to something else that's interesting, or take grep out, if we just want to output, everything in that file. But, is come up with some way to make this a little bit more meaningful if you can. And submit that as deliverable. Actually, let me check for you. This is going to be deliverable C, or I'm sorry, this is going to be deliverable D for the slow query log. So deliverable d.txt is going to be this log file that you create with the slow query log. But we also want to do this with the database log. So or with a database table. So we're going to go back into the config file. And I want to try something here. I'm going to do this kind of in real time in the video. I've never really tried this before, but I was just reading in the documentation as I'm recording this video that you can actually put file comma table, and it will do both. I am dubious. I've never tried this before. I don't know if it's going to work, but let's give it a try. So I'm going to restart the server. It's going to take a second to restart, I think. I'm going to come down here and run this query again. Took 1.98 seconds. Let's see if it output this to our file. So it's just like it's the same format as the general query log, but it's going to be mysql.slow_log, I think. Let's see if we get anything. There are 5 rows. So, yep, and there's that query that we just did. So it's in there. And if we did this right, if this actually worked, if the documentation's accurate, which I tend to think it would be, yeah, there it is, right? So it's logging both now. So now I have both the file and I have the database, right, at the same time. Like I said, if we do an explain on this, right? So if we, do a create, show create for mysql.slowlog. Make this bigger so we can see it. So these are the rows that we have, right, or the columns that we have. We have user host again, right, which we didn't have in the file log. Number of rows that are sent back, the rows that were examined, and the actual SQL text, right? I think all 3 of those would be interesting, right? So maybe we'll select user host, rows sent, rows examined, and the SQL text. So user_host. And then we'll do, actually query time is probably a good one, right? Query time, rows sent, rows examined, and then the SQL text. There we go. And just like I showed you before, we could put that /G on the front just so it's a little bit easier to read it in the console, right? So it's a little bit easier to read in the console. So here we can see that the query time was 530 microseconds, right? That's how long it took to run this particular query, the last one on the list there. So the actual statement that we ran, which is this one right here, that took 1.485436 seconds to run. It sent 100 rows, but it looked at 7,512, and there's the actual SQL statement that was run, right? So lots of neat stuff we can get from this. And again, we could do a where clause if we're only looking for certain parameters, right? Maybe just from a certain host name, or it's coming from a certain user account. Maybe we have a certain application that people are reporting is running slow, and we're trying to figure out, what's going on. Why is this particular application running slow? Let's see what kinds of queries they're doing, and check to see which of those queries is taking the most time, right? In fact, I think what we could probably do, let's see if this works. Let's do an order by on here, right? Order by query time descending, right? So now we're going to have the longest query on the top with the shortest on the bottom, right? Maybe I want to do this in the opposite order. All right, so I get the longest one on the bottom since that's where I'm looking, or I can do a limit, right? So I get the shortest one. I wonder if I can switch this. There we go. So all kinds of stuff you can do for looking at these logs. So you can play around with that query, and you're going to create a text file and submit that as deliverable. Let me just check here. So that's going to be deliverable e.txt. So this is the fifth part of the assignment, deliverable e.txt. You're going to output this to a text file and submit that as deliverable e. Make sure it's a text file. Make sure all these files that you submit in Blackboard are .txt. Because if you make them anything else, if you make it .sql or make it .csv or anything like that, sometimes Blackboard has a hard time with those files, and it doesn't let me download them, and it doesn't save them properly, and all kinds of stuff happens because Blackboard tries to figure out what the files are and tries to present them to the user. So it can be kind of a pain. So make sure you make it a .txt file if you're turning this in for your assignment. So that's the 5 parts of this assignment. Hopefully you'll learn a little bit about logging. And this will help you moving forward in this course so that, as we do some troubleshooting later on, we're going to do some more advanced things with the database as we go through the rest of this quarter, and it'll be useful for you to have this, know how to turn on these log files and use them. I would also recommend that you turn these off. So make sure you turn off this logging, especially the general query log and the slow query log, right? Turn those off. Otherwise, it's going to slow down your system, especially because we built our systems with really low specs. Although, we're really not doing a lot of stuff with our database, it's not going to probably hurt anything to leave it on, but just good to be in the habit of turning off this type of debug logging if you don't need it. But at the same time, it's interesting to think about, what's an appropriate level of logging if you have to maintain auditing, right? So a lot of times, what we're finding in IT now is you have these audit requirements where they're asking you to do audit logging and save those logs so that you can go back and audit activity, and somebody can audit what's happening with different applications. So especially with things like Sarbanes-Oxley and HIPAA and even internal governance and all the other types of certifications that auditors would come in and look at your system. It's good to know how to do this stuff and also to know what the ramifications are of turning all this on. So if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.